Sundays with Hridaan. Today I am going to read this one, the newspaper dog, and here are the contents that these stories I've read. The Tale of Love and Whiskers I'm going to read, and this in the last video I read this one, the mouse and the squirrel. You remember that? And today I'm going to read the newspaper dog. And here is some. This book is by Enid Blyton. Once upon a time, there was a little dog called Tips. He belonged to Mrs. Brown, who lived in Primrose Cottage at the end of Cherry Village. He was a useful little dog. He guarded the house. Oh, every dog does that, especially police dogs. When night guarded the house each night for Mrs. Brown, that no thief comes and thieves the jewelry of Mrs. Brown, and then when she goes out, then she doesn't get the jewelry. And Mrs. Brown kept her company. When she was alone, he barked at any stranger, like he'll bite like this. But he looked at this. Who came up in the front part, and each 1 week he fetched a newspaper from her old Mrs. Jonathan, who lived by himself in a little house on the hillside. Mrs. Jonathan always bought the newspaper himself and read it. Then he lent to Mrs. Brown, and after that she passed into someone else. She couldn't often find time to go fetch the paper herself, so Tips fetched it for her. He started off with evening, ran all the way down the village street, went over the bridge and across the stream and up the hillside to Mr. Jonathan's cottage. He jumped at it. He put the packet into Tip's mouth. Little packet, like dogs eating food. In the little dog who running on the way home again, no stopping for anyone until he reached Primrose Cottage and dropped the newspaper on Mrs. Brown's feet. Reached the Primrose Cottage, he could drop the paper at Mrs. Brown's feet. One day, Mr. Jonathan thought he would do some spring cleaning, so he called the Mrs. Brown and asked her to lend him her letter. Dear me, what do you want to go climbing? What about on ladders for? Asked Mrs. Brown in surprise. You will fall off, Mrs. Jonathan, and hurt yourself. Indeed, I shan't, said the old man. I am going to paint my ceiling white. Mrs. Brown was very dirty, so lend me your step ladder. There's a good soul. It's on the shelf, Mrs. Brown, and you can have it if you want it, but do not, pray, be careful, Mr. Jonathan, for it's not a very steady pair of steps. But I think he's gonna fall. Mr. Jonathan found a letter and took it home. He mixed the paint and started to ceiling. It looked lovely, mostly lovely. All day he worked at it and then went to bed. He began again next day, whistling to himself, sloshing about on the ceiling with the paint, quite enjoying himself. In a dreadful thing happened. The postman dropped some letters in box and gave such a loud rat shot that Mr. John fell from his ladder and ow! Crash! Fully flat and crashed it and dropped the little bug and little was such a rat stuck metal for ladder. Down he went and when he tried to get up but he found he couldn't. Oh dear, my God, I must have sprained my ankle for. And he was an old man, huh? My broken leg or something, the old man groaned. Whatever shall I do? Somebody else will come today when I can't phone for the doctor. I have no neighbors to call. I am all alone. Mr. Jonathan lay there on the floor, groaning. He really didn't know what he was going to do. Like this. He felt sleepy and then slept on the floor. Like that. Perhaps he would have to stay there all night long. Only if somebody would come, but there was nobody to come at all. But one dog came. And you know whose name is that? The newspaper dog, Tips. To come at all, then just he was thinking that Mr. Jonathan heard a sound of pitter-patting feet and something came running up in the front part. It was Tips. But it was not her, it was he. Thinking Mr. Jonathan heard the sound of pitter-patting feet, someone red coming back and little body. We know who is it. It's the dog. Itself against the door which opened and it was Tips, I told you. The little newspaper dog coming to get the evening paper. He saw Mrs. Jonathan laying on the floor. He was puzzled. He ran up to and licked his hand. Then he sat down with his head on one side and said, "Oof." That was on his way saying, "What's the matter? Can I help you? I wish you could." Tips and Mr. Jonathan, and then he suddenly looked more careful, more cheerful. Then I fell down. Now I get many rests. Perhaps Tips could help him. He looked around. The newspaper was a chair already tied up with a string for Mrs. Jones. There was a paper. Tip said, "Mr. Jonathan, pointing, fetch it here." Tip saw the paper and took it into its mouth. He was just going to run off with it when Mrs. Jonathan called him back. "Don't go yet, Tips," he said. He was just writing like this. He was just writing like this and then he was writing the newspaper. "Bring the paper here." The clever little dog understood. He ran over Mr. Jonathan with the paper in his mouth. Mr. Jonathan took a pencil from the pocket and wrote a large letters across the top of the paper. "Mrs. Brown, I have fallen off the ladder. Please fetch the doctor, Mr. Jonathan." Then he pushed the paper once more into Tip's mouth and pet him. The waiting dog, "Go home now," he said. Tips ran off puzzling with his leg. To know Mrs. Jonathan was on the floor, he ran to Mrs. Brown and soon he reached Primrose Cottage and dropped the paper at her feet. She picked up the paper and caught sight of the message scribbled on the top. "Good gracious me!" cried poor old Mr. Jonathan. He stumbled off the ladder. Then they lifted him up and got in the bed, look here, and gave in hot tea. Then it will be better. She sent for the doctor at once. But I don't like to take injections. Nobody likes. And once they took along Mrs. Jonathan in his car, it wasn't long before they had him safely in his bed, leg bandaged. Let me see. No, it's not there. Leg bandaged. They had safety in his bed and bandaged up with a nice hot drink beside him. But it was very clever. It was my clever little dog Tips who found Mr. Jonathan. When he came for my paper this evening, says Mrs. Brown, proudly the doctor. Mrs. Jonathan wrote a message on the paper, and of course I saw it. When Tips dropped the paper on my feet,